What's going on, folks? Welcome back to the channel. So I think we have a problem, a little bit of a problem as a gun community. And let me see if I can explain this. It probably says it in the title. I think one of the problems we have nowadays is we try to push competition-oriented guns into a duty role. What I mean by a duty role is like a law enforcement role, a military role. Perfect example of this is the P320. Now, this video is not on the P320, but Phil Strader himself stated that they wanted to give people the best trigger they could and the lightest trigger they could to help increase hits. And I get that. In theory, in practice, I think that's part of the trouble that the 320 has, is also that, as well as, all the other myriad of issues that I personally believe, just my personal opinion, is going on with the 320 platform. My buddy Jason from the Texas Gun Vault mentioned this statement he made a statement a while ago about SIG gave you the gun you wanted. What he meant by that was, what I believe he meant by that was, people kept complaining about the trigger on Glocks. Triggers suck on Glocks and Glock clones, and this trigger sucks, trigger sucks. So SIG said, okay, well, we'll give you this really light competition trigger with no trigger safety, with no, on a lot of the models other than the military ones, which the military is actually the ones that requested a thumb safety. No trigger dingus, no thumb safety. It's basically a competition gun, in my opinion, that was tried to be pushed into a duty role with some serious issues, okay? Aside from it's a retrofitted 250 that they shoved this Rube Goldberg engineering nightmare into the gun, again, in my opinion. But the 320 is not the real problem. I think the real problem is, and it's not a problem for a lot of us folks, for the 20% that are really deep into the community. And I've discussed this with several people in the past, and I believe about 80% of the 2A community are casuals. They own 1 to 4 guns, maybe a shotgun, a couple of handguns, maybe an AR. Some of them don't even go that far. They own 1 to 4 guns. They shoot maybe 50 to 100 rounds a year. There are a lot of people out there like that. You wouldn't imagine. But the industry is driven by guys like us, by gun geeks, by gun nerds, by autistic gun dorks like the rest of us that are really into all the details and the engineering and the history and the ballistics and the caliber. And we just geek out on all that stuff. We're like, yeah, give us this, give it this. This is what we want. But is what we want and what a lot of gun companies are like, okay, they listen to us, because a lot of us do know a lot of what we're talking about. And I'm talking about the 20% there. And they say, okay, we give that to you, but then the 80% gets a hold of it and you have disastrous effects. Instead of designing the gun for the lowest common denominator, because whenever you design a gun, all right, it's a piece of engineering. And I hear people like, well, if you set it on the table, it could sit there for 1,000 years and never go off. Of course. But in that equation is the human factor. You have to account for the human factor in the equation of building a firearm, because the human is what decides when and where it goes off, how it goes off, where it's pointed, what direction it's pointed in, all that other kind of stuff. So you have to factor that into what is the human going to do when they get a hold of this? The same thing applies to any mechanical device, any machine. The car could sit there. You could build a car, sit it there for 50 years, and it won't kill anybody in a car accident. It won't drive drunk. It won't do none of that stuff, because this is, you have to the human has to interact with that to make it happen. And whether that's the human walking around and it's rattling in your holster and it just goes off allegedly, or whatever it is, you have to have human input on that product. Okay. And we're talking about firearms. So I was talking to another buddy of mine, Chris, from the Muffin Top Tactical podcast. I'll put a link to his podcast down below this video. And we were talking about, and I had this theory. I said, so when modern day competition came up, okay, or it came into being, I should say, Colonel Jeff Cooper is widely regarded as the father of modern IPSC, USPSA competition with handguns, right? And back then, you would press duty handguns. So you would press handguns such as the 1911, revolvers, things like that. You would push those guns that were designed for a military, for law enforcement. They weren't designed for speed shooting competitions. That wasn't a thing yet. And then they would press those duty rated guns, whether they were like law enforcement or military duty, rated guns into competition. And the competition shooters started modifying a little bit. A whole industry grew up of how can we get them to shoot faster and flatter and all this other kind of stuff on a flat, controlled range. Now let's remember these competitions, these USPSA and IDPA and all that other kind of stuff, they're cold ranges. All right. So you walk around 90% of your match, you're walking around with an empty gun. You don't load it until you get online and it's your turn and the RO instructs you to load and make ready or gas it up or whatever they like to say, right? Load and make ready. And then you have a scorekeeper and your RO right behind you. So you have two people monitoring you for safety violations and stuff like that. You load, reholster, you shoot maybe 20 to 30 second stage. That's a big stage, right? Then you unload and show clear and reholster. So you're walking around with an empty handgun for the most part during a match. So you can afford to get away with certain things that you wouldn't if you were like a police officer and you're carrying that same gun geared towards competition all day long, every day. And it's walking around, it's rattling, all that other kind of stuff. I think in the beginning of competition, people were pressing duty weapons that were designed for a duty purpose into competition. And now I think competition has gotten so big and so popular that people are thinking, well, I'd rather have this for a duty carry gun. And they push that, and concealed carry wasn't a thing back then either. Let's not forget, it really wasn't a thing like it is nowadays. I think I could push this competition gun. You know, this competition gun shoots really great. It shoots flat. It's got a very light trigger. I disabled the grip safety, stuff like that. I'm going to push it into a concealed carry role. That's not what it was designed for. I think that is part of our problem. I think those guns, I think competition guns in general, were designed by people that have very good gun handling skills. They know what they're doing. They're pretty much well versed in competition, and those guns end up, those features, because like Phil Strader that works for Sig Sauer, he was a big competition shooter. A lot of these, Ernie Langdon, I could go down the list. They are big competition shooters. I think they took some of that competition knowledge and they put them into duty guns, which turns out it's not always the best thing. Okay. So here is one of my favorite guns, the M9 platform, the Beretta, the 92 series or 90 series, as they call it. I have stated before, and I stand by this, I believe this is one of the best duty handguns ever made. I think it's the safest. I think it is extremely reliable and very accurate. I think we slept on these guns a lot. Now, I had a love-hate relationship with this gun for a long time because I carried one in the Army, but they weren't maintained properly and they were clapped out. But mine worked pretty damn good. But I've stated before that I believe this is the safest handgun on the market. I think this is the safest duty handgun. Now, is this setup right here, the M9, just like this setup, is this the optimal competition gun? No, I believe this is the optimal duty gun because you can do everything with this particular firearm with the safety on. You can load, unload, holster, unload. You don't even have to, you can do everything you need to do with this gun with the safety on. You never have to take the safety off of this firearm until you're ready to shoot. Sorry about that. Anyway, where was I? You could do everything you need to do with this gun as far as load, unload, safety, everything with the safeties on. You never need to take them off until you're ready to fire. And I know people are like, well, I can't reach the thumb safety and all that kind of jazz. I know my hands, people's hands are different, but there's also a way you can come up with your non-dominant hand. But anyway, that's a side note. This gun also has when you see that, it has a two-piece firing pin. When you rotate the safety down, you're actually rotating the firing pin out of the way. Not to mention, it has a firing pin block there too. One of the safest, most reliable, most accurate handgun platforms ever. Is it ideal for a USPSA, IDPA, whatever, maybe IDPA, but for like a USPSA or competition? No. So people competition them up. All right. They have the new competition models that are single stack and got comps and all competition. That gun, I would not press into a duty roll. I would not press the 9211s into a duty roll. I think it's a little bit too dangerous. It's a single action only, frame mounted thumb safety. I think this, again, catering to the 80%, okay, of people, especially when I'm in the case of the M9 when they adopted it, of soldiers. I remember hearing this story, I don't know if it's true, but it might have been off of Syrian Arsenal, that when they adopted the 1911, John Browning had an external extractor, and the Army weapons boards, said, make it internal. We don't want the soldiers fiddling with it and taking guns apart. Yet now they have the modular handgun system where they could tear the whole thing apart. Back then, they said they knew soldiers were going to fiddle with stuff, and they said, put the extractor inside the gun so they can't take it apart, lose it, and the gun's broken. This gun is super simple to operate, to teach people, and to use. I think the biggest problem is people did not either want to take the time, they weren't interested, they didn't have the money. I know the Army didn't have the money to teach people how to properly use, to transition from double, single. Okay, that's a tough transition for a lot of people if you don't know how to shoot handguns and if you don't want to take the time. I'll absolutely admit that it takes a lot of time for you to master double, single action, that transition in there. A lot of people will just torch that first one off and then shoot, because it's much easier, again, to shoot single action. But I think this is a perfect example in the 1911 when people, my point with the whole thing was, back in the day before competition really took off, the focus was duty rated handguns or duty engineered handguns pushed into a competition role. I think that is flipped. I think we are taking a lot of stuff, and don't get me wrong, competition is awesome and it gives us a lot of great benefits. And I think everybody should run out there and shoot some IDPA, USPSA Steel Challenge, all that other stuff, but realize what it is. The competition gun is not necessarily, and matter of fact, it rarely ever, if ever, is a perfect fit for the field and for duty, and especially for go-to-war guns. Anybody remember the Ross rifle? The Ross rifle, by all accounts, it was a competition gun to start off. They made it, send it to the trenches in France, and it failed. People hated it. It completely failed. The sights were too small and fiddly. It didn't work. Okay. Which is why I think like the AK-47 is probably one of the best trench go-to-war guns, but they're not, if you notice, they're very hard to modify. They're not very modular, and to push into a competition role, you can, but they're not ideal for competition roles. So that's basically my point. I think in the beginning of modern day USPSA, the start of it, when Colonel Cooper was oppressing basically stock, they were using a lot of stock 1911, stuff like that. And yes, they started upgrading, but it's gotten to the point where now that competition design has trickled down into duty rated firearms. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing from a safety standpoint. So there it is, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time.